Good to see everyone here. Feels great to be finally back here at the Mark Taper Auditorium. I want to thank the LAPL, the Technical Services Department, History Department, the California desk. I don't know all the names. There have been some staff turnovers, but I know Kelly Wallace has been instrumental. We have Alan up at the control booth. Thank you for everyone. I'm Todd Godowski. I'm the president of the Los Angeles City Historical Society. I hope you are aware of our programs. Most of you are probably members. If you're not, I hope you'd consider joining. Membership dues are our primary revenue. We try to hold a lot of other events. The Marine Northrop Lecture Series is our primary in-person lecture series, but we do a lot of presentations now via the web. But, you know, it does take a little funding to put that together, to pay for our Zoom license, to help us find speakers and all that, do some publicity work, publications and printing and stuff. So if you could contribute by joining, becoming a member, we would sure appreciate it. And at the conclusion of the event, the speaker tonight will be able to take some questions. Her books are available for sale out in the lobby, and I believe she'll sign them for you. You may have a chance to ask her a question or two. And Lennart, one of our board members, will be handling memberships. If anyone does care to join today, while you're there, you can make a membership payment. And so I'm going to introduce the chairman of the Marine Northrop Lecture Series Committee, who's responsible for coordinating all of this today, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you. Michael Holland.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out. It is so good to see you. It is actually so good to be seen anywhere, you know, by anybody. And even though we're distancing and wearing masks, hopefully you'll share my joy that this is probably going to be one of the first events we've had in a while where we don't have to hear the words, "You're muted." You know, we'll be able to hear everybody just fine. When we get to the Q&A part later on the presentation, Todd will have a floor mic, and what we'll do is we'll, you know, point out who's got questions, and then you'll be able to ask your question of, you know, of Dr. Knatz. I will point out that one of the first questions we'll probably start thinking about is the world has changed so much in the 20 months since we had originally planned to do this presentation. And so, you know, this whole thing, supply chain and stuff like that, which has been on, you know, everybody's mind. Geraldine has promised that she will, you know, answer questions about that if, in fact, there's 1,000 or 2,000 questions out there about supply chain. But so basically, what we're going to do right now is I'm going to introduce Geraldine. She is going to have her PowerPoint. And then she and I will sit down and we'll go over the PowerPoint. We'll go over some other, you know, topics that have come to mind. We'll open it up to the floor for your questions. And then at that point in time, we'll go back out to the lobby if there's any other further discussions, and certainly the book sales and book signing that Geraldine will be more than happy to help you with. And so without further ado, let me make a quick introduction. Dr. Geraldine Knatz was for some time the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles. And I am sure she is probably very grateful that she does not have that job now. There was
when I was there.
Well, there were a lot of things going on that Geraldine was involved with when she was there, and I hope we can touch on some of those as well. If she doesn't toot her own horn, I'll have to. But she has been involved with ports, with environmental science, because I believe that was your major one back in the day, and so environmental science, and of course, you know, the management of shipping and transportation and so forth has been, you know, her life's work, and so she's also written several books on Terminal Island. She has written a book, this one on the Port of LA, and she is also a board member on the Los Angeles City Historical Society. And so she's a tremendous contributor to our work And I'll just second what Todd said. If you like anything that you see us doing here, you've got Geraldine to thank for that to a certain extent. You have the rest of us to, thank a little bit. And you can show your appreciation by becoming part of the family, as it were. And so, we can do more stuff like this and do stuff that you want to see and hear and talk about. All right, so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the podium over to Dr. Geraldine Knatz.
So thank you, Michael. I think since I'm pretty far away from you, that I can probably keep my mask down, so it's going to be a lot easier for me to speak to you that way. Let me say I'm very happy to be here. I think this is actually my first in-person event. In March of 2020, the book had just been released. There was a big event planned at USC that was co-sponsored by the Huntington Library and USC with a wine and cheese reception. And the day it was, that week was the week that everything shut down. So thank you for coming to my book launch, like about 18 months later. So, and there's a lot of different ways to view the history of the Port of Los Angeles, from the perspective of labor, from the development perspective, as many of the port's books do. The port has published books, we built this and we built that. And many books about LA Harbor focus on the late 19th century battle between Santa Monica and San Pedro. I'm hearing a little echo. Is that okay? Am I here? Is the voice good? I'm good. Okay. All right. That battle between Santa Monica and San Pedro, which was really a battle between the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Terminal Island Railway for federal funding to construct what was going to become the Port of Los Angeles. Well, I have to tell you, this is not that story. This is really the 20th century history of the port. And because I view all history as biography, I chose to write a book about people. And there aren't a lot of books about port people, and so there's going to be maybe people that you've never really heard of. And I have to say, in doing my research, I found there were harbor leaders that were visionaries. There were harbor leaders that were greedy. There were harbor leaders that believed in serving the city, and there were some that believed in serving themselves. And I do have to say that latter group was kind of interesting to research. So, just a refresher about geography, about Los Angeles and Long Beach Harbor, for those of you that haven't been down there lately. And I'm also going to be mentioning a few locations, and I want to point them out to you. So first of all, big thing, Port of Los Angeles on this side, on the left side, Port of Long Beach on the right side, Terminal Island right here in the middle. I'm going to be mentioning another island known as Mormon Island right here. It's actually a peninsula now, but at one time it was an island. When I mentioned Far East Wilmington, I'm talking about this area of the port and the consolidated slip where the Dominguez Channel comes down into the port. The community of San Pedro here, Wilmington here. I'll mention City Dock number 1, the city's first municipal pier, and that's where the big old warehouse is still there. And then I'll also mention where the Los Angeles Cruise Terminal is. This was the area when I talk about the Naval Air Station. We were in this area on Terminal Island, and then the Long Beach Naval Station and Shipyard was over here on this side. So that's just a little bit about a refresher on your geography. So the first person I'm going to introduce you to is Thomas E. Gibbon. He was a progressive Southern Democrat. He hitched his star to many Los Angeles notables like Harry Chandler. He had his fingers in many pies, but no one had ever really heard of this guy. His name would show up on documents, and the book introduction, which was written by William Deverell from the Huntington Library, tells the story about how he found Gibbon's records in a garage in Palm Springs. I spent months going through these boxes. Were donated to the Huntington Library. I spent months going through those boxes, and I have concluded that Gibbon is as important to the history of 20th century Los Angeles Harbor as Phineas Manning had been in the 19th century. But to understand Gibbon, I have to step back a little bit into the 19th century and tell you about an incident that happened to him in 1891. He was new to Los Angeles. His client was the Terminal Railway, and he applied to the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors for a franchise to build a wharf on Rattlesnake Island, which was the original name of what we today call Terminal Island. So Rattlesnake Island is, my pointer, I have to kind of move and see where it's going. Where's my pointer? It's right over there, Rattlesnake Island, Dead Man's Island here, the first breakwater. So it was in this area of East San Pedro that Thomas E. Gibbon applied for this franchise to build a wharf. So on the day of the hearing before the county supervisors, instrode several prominent Los Angeles attorneys, including Stephen M. White. They were there to protest. They were representing a lumberman from San Francisco named John A. Hooper. They claimed that Hooper held a state patent on the property and was the rightful owner. So in typical fashion for a governing body that's caught off guard, they held the item over a week. So Gibbon had 1 week to make his case. In the course of doing his legal research, he discovered the state of California had erroneously sold state tidelands to individuals, when in fact it was supposed to be reserved for public use for navigation. Gibbon went back, presented his case, and got the franchise. So I spent a lot of time up in Sacramento working through each file in the State Lands Commission office, and I was able to compile the most comprehensive map of all the land parcels that the state sold in Los Angeles Harbor. And if you look at it, it sort of looks like a map of Los Angeles Harbor. They were all sales by the state, except for one sale by the federal government of Mormon Island to a member of the Banning family. Essentially, the entire inner harbor was sold off, and most of the outer harbor. This is what Gibbon saw. He tried to sound the alarm. He went to the city of San Pedro. It was a separate city at that time. He went to the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. Nobody was really interested in the tidelands. This was way before that free harbor fight over whether the harbor was going to be in Santa Monica or San Pedro. So, it was 1891. No one cared. So Gibbon sat on that information for 16 years. In 1907, he was appointed to the first board of harbor commissioners. Now, at that time, Wilmington and San Pedro were not even part of the city of LA, but the city of LA decided to form a harbor commission. In those intervening years, while Gibbon was sitting on this information, a group of progressive reformers rose to prominence in Los Angeles government. The progressives believed in municipal control over utilities, vital civil services like water and power. That reform movement thrust Gibbon into a position where he could do something about municipal control of the harbor, and that's exactly what he did. One of the first major actions of the new Board of Harbor Commissioners, Gibbon pushed for the state of California to file suit against the property owners on the waterfront to recover the property. So in 1900, what does that say? Whoops. What happened? Oh, there we go. All right. So in 1909, the state...
Actually, this is a better laser pointer, that button.
Oh, all right. Okay, fabulous. Okay. In 1909, the state filed a series of cases against the landowners and the tenants in the harbor, and they went before a judge named Walter Bordwell, who actually became more famous for presiding over the trial over the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building. By the time Bordwell's ruling came out, the city had already consolidated with Wilmington and San Pedro, and his ruling was, the city's the rightful owner of all the tidelands. So naturally, the property owners were not going to accept that. They appealed the cases. The California it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court ruled that except where land had been paid for and was not within 2 miles of an incorporated town, the property owners got fee title. Not all the waterfront, but hundreds of acres still went to the private property owners, including the Banning family and the railroad. But It was encumbered with a public easement for navigation. So everyone's like, what the heck does that mean? You know, the property owners were like, I'm not going to invest any money in my property now, because who knows when the city of LA is going to try and exert its navigation easement. It was somewhat of a mess. And so at that time, Los Angeles lost a lot of businesses to Long Beach Harbor, because over in Long Beach, nobody really cared that much about the tidelands back then. People could come in and buy waterfront in Long Beach Harbor, so we lost the Ford Motor Company, Procter & Gamble Soap Factory. They all went to Long Beach. Long Beach would actually turn out to fight more for control of Tidelands oil than actually the ownership of the waterfront. Finally, in 1917, the city and the Banning family and the railroad reached an agreement that basically dealt with much of the property, basically telling the property owners, you have it for 30 years, you can do what you want, but after 30 years, it reverts to the city. So now Gibbon had another challenge on his plate. Besides making sure the state tidelands was not in private hands, he was also very involved in the consolidation of Wilmington and San Pedro with Los Angeles, and then making sure that the tidelands got transferred to the city. Both these efforts were successful, but it brought Gibbon into the crosshairs of Senator William H. Savage, a pugnacious character who debated with his fist. Now, this man's life reads like a movie script. He was a prisoner during the Civil War. He was on a ship that was blown up, you know, and he went into the drink. He came west, and he was sheriff of Cochise County, Arizona. He was editor of the Tombstone Epitaph not long after the likes of Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp strode those streets. So he also was the first city attorney for the city of San Pedro, and he drafted the charter for the city. No way was he going to support a Los Angeles takeover of San Pedro. But Gibbon had the ultimate weapon. He became the editor of the Los Angeles Herald. He used the paper to champion consolidating the cities while also making Savage look like he was in the pocket of Southern Pacific Railroad. And there were a lot of derogatory comments at Savage, you know, basically, you know, using his name, Savage. And, you know, those of you that know about the Southern Pacific, you know, history in LA, you know, even though this was all behind us now and the port was down in the harbor, you know, where it is today, the animosity against the Southern Pacific Railroad was long to die. So when you peg somebody as in the pocket of the Southern Pacific, that was, you know, something that, you know, the public noticed. But an orchestrated campaign by the Times and the Herald to publish derogatory cartoons about Savage on the same day caused Savage to explode. He took to the floor of the state legislature and he lambasted Gibbon, who then had Savage arrested for defamation. Savage then threatened Gibbon with a duel. And let me tell you, the legislature was all a Twitter about this going on. So when the defamation case made it to court, Savage was exonerated because the court ruled that a statement published in the legislative record was not defamation. So, of course, the city had made a deal with the property owners, like, hey, we're going to keep our hands off for 30 years. Let me tell you, they had no intention of honoring that deal. And no more was that more obvious than in the battle over Mormon Island. So, you know, as I said, Mormon Island was something that Bannon's purchased as a federal permit, as a federal patent. It was an island. It wasn't tidelands that the state told. It was an island. But, and as part of the 30-year deal, the city said, hey, we're going to drop our suit trying to get back Mormon Island. You know, you get that for 30 years. So the city did everything they could do to thwart the Banning's use of their property and undermine businesses that were located on Banning property. Customers who did business with the Bannings were blackballed by the harbor. If the Bannings leased part of their land to the customer, the city would pursue that company relentlessly, buy out the lease, and then move that land to a customer to a place in the port where the city had control, property that was city property. The city also took other retaliatory actions against the Bannings on land that they owned in downtown Los Angeles. The city took the Bannings to court again in 1930 because they thought they had new evidence that Mormon Island was not really an island. Maybe it was really Tidelands. And so they brought another suit. And this is a battle that involves shotgun-toting Bannings and years of litigation. And you know, the city really exhausted the private property owners. Not only the Bannings, but the Kirchhoff-Kuzner family, who owned land where the cruise terminal was. They sold out because they were tired of the fight. And for a while, the port was satisfied. But over the years, as cargo grew, privately owned property in Far East Wilmington and along the Consolidated Slip started to look good to the city. And the city went for that land too. The last suit over a private terminal on the Consolidated Slip settled in 1980. And I can remember I had just started working for the LA Harbor Department, and I remember hearing about this condoc suit. And of course, back then I didn't know what the heck Tidelands was. But it was from 1907, what Gibbon started, went all the way, not continuously, but wasn't really finished until 1980. The city view of the harbor pioneers was that they owned land, they were competitors to municipal control, they paid no rent to the city, and they had to go. And it was kind of a repeat of what the city had done in the Owens Valley. And that's why, William Devereux calls this the LA saltwater story. When you look at the Owens Valley, that's LA's freshwater story. But things were different on the other side of the bay. Private companies developed the Port of Long Beach. On the Los Angeles side, harbor commissioners could make tough decisions and then retreat to their home someplace in LA, and it generally was not in the harbor area. In Long Beach, the Long Beach harbor commissioners and the private port developers would end their week by retreating to the Pacific Coast Club overlooking Long Beach Port and to play poker. And I know this because Jim Craig, my neighbor, whom I interviewed for this book, actually served on the Long Beach Harbor Commission in the 1960s, as his father had decades before him. And this is an aerial shot of the Craig shipyard. The Craig family still owns property in the Port of Long Beach. You may have noticed recently, in the last week, was an article in the paper that the port bought some more private property, and in the article it mentioned the Craig family trust still owns that property. So this cozy relationship between LA harbor pioneers and between Long Beach harbor pioneers and Long Beach city leaders never existed in Los Angeles. In fact, Phineas Banning's son Hancock went to meet with the Long Beach folks to say, why aren't you trying to kick out the private property owners? Well, you had city officials in Long Beach serving on the boards of the private landowners in the harbor, on the boards of those businesses, and you had members of those business families being harbor commission. Let me tell you, there was no Banning family that ever served on the harbor commission in the city of Los Angeles. So this was actually a beneficial policy for Long Beach in acquiring some of those customers like Ford Motor Company and Procter & Gamble. But it still meant that large chunks of Los Angeles, Long Beach Harbor, would still be under private control. So the most shocking thing to me about Gibbon and this early period was learning that Thomas Gibbon had an idea for a municipal railroad operating on a double-track, grade-separated corridor between Los Angeles and the harbor, and all the railroads would use the same corridor. This was in 1910. Back then, only 2 streets ran from Los Angeles, downtown LA, to the harbor. Alameda Street and San Pedro Street, which is, as you get further south, it becomes Avalon Boulevard. San Pedro Street was the one selected for this consolidated rail corridor. They acquired property, they had a groundbreaking, but construction never went forward. Gibbon, as a progressive, thought the city should operate the railroad and the city should operate a steamship line, but municipal operation did not really work in the harbor. Charter amendments required certain wharves to be operated by the city, and they sat empty while the private wharves were doing all the business. So the city did not have monopoly control over shipping and rail operations. So they ultimately, their passion then became, we had to own all of the property. So it was very different than what happened with water and power. And so, after there was a change in mayor and trucks became more common, the new mayor, Mayor Rose, came in. I'm like, I don't want to do this consolidated rail corridor. So some 70 years later, I, along with others, spent years scratching our head trying to figure out how we could solve the freight rail congestion in Los Angeles Harbor and Los Angeles Basin. And we thought we invented this great idea, a consolidated rail corridor between the harbor and downtown that all the railroads would use. And so it took nearly a century to get it done, but the double-track grade-separated rail corridor, the Alameda Corridor, opened in 2002. This time, along the alignment of Alameda Street. This is warehouse number 1 on the city's first municipal pier. It was supposed to be constructed in time for opening up the Panama Canal in 1914. It didn't make it. 1913 is called the Year of Civil War in the City of Los Angeles government, as the Board of Public Works and the Board of Harbor Commissioners fought over who got to control the money to build the wharves and pilings and structures in LA Harbor. The entire Harbor Commission, who favored concrete wharves, resigned. Concrete ultimately won out, and so that's why this pier, warehouse, and warehouse number 1 and the city dock number 1 still exist. But city charter provisions that were in existence in 1947 prevented them from leasing this facility to private property owners, and that amendment wasn't removed until 1947. By then, well, really from the get-go, this warehouse was obsolete. And actually, this warehouse still has a fascinating history that I don't have time to go through now, but it's in the book. It was the submarine base in World War I. The roof was used as a quarantine for people with the influenza in 1918. The building was also a quarantine for imported zoo animals, and today it's mostly record storage. The rest of the pier is now out to sea at the Port of Los Angeles, and that's where Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, that's his winter home now. He comes and spends it in LA Harbor at this pier. So in 1920, we enter the era of Walter B. Allen. Now, as you can see by the cartoon, his appointment on the Harbor Board was viewed as an opportunity to clean out corruption in contracting that plagued the port's engineering department. And that's a story I don't have time for, but it involved breaking into employees' homes and trying to steal inspection reports about faulty pilings. But Walter B. Allen founded Allen Brothers Trucking. He was on the Board of Harbor Commissioners, and he ran the place with an iron fist. He was on the board for over a decade until 1933, and he worked out of his trucking office in Wilmington. So I thought, gee, if Bill Devereaux can find Gibbons records and Walter B. Allen is working out of his own office, maybe there's a garage someplace filled with boxes of records that I can discover about the Walter B. Allen era. So I thought, okay, I got to find his grandkids. So I went on Ancestry, I went on LinkedIn, I found these two guys. I thought, oh my God, these could be grandkids. So I was like, okay, how do I approach them? Because their father got himself into all sorts of trouble. But I sent them an email saying how Grandpa was a visionary because he started the first municipal airport in the city of Los Angeles. But in these days, he would have run afoul of conflict of interest, and that was really putting it mildly. They both responded immediately, copying every member of the family. And no, they did not have a garage stuffed with records, but they had a photo album, and they would send me some of the photos. And I think some of these photos are very significant in LA history. And here is one of those photos. Now, on the top here is Walter B. Allen as a young man sitting on this photo is dated 1909, the first 5-ton truck in Los Angeles. Walter B. Allen started out as a paper boy working for Harry Chandler, delivering papers by horse and wagon. And they actually sent me some of those pictures too. Harry Chandler lent him money to purchase this truck. And so Allen Brothers Trucking really grew big. They moved the big guns into Fort MacArthur. They brought in all the marble to create City Hall. But Allen saw no issue with trucking the cargo for port customers while he was Harbor Commission president. So by 1926, concerns were raised about Allen's conflicts. However, he remained on the board until 1933. Okay, so who knows what building that is behind that?
The Herald Examiner?
No, it's the Pico House. Yeah, so, and that's an old fire station, the other one further down. Here's another family photo, the first ever event that took place in LA City Hall. And I wish I had known Stephen G. was doing a book about LA City Hall, because this photo should have been in it. This was unifying rail operations into a belt line. It was kind of a fallback plan when the municipal harbor deal didn't go forward. They did unify the rail operation of the 4 railroads that were inside the port. And so the man in the middle signing the documents is Walter B. Allen. And I've actually been able to identify a number of the men in this picture. The Harbor Belt Line lasted until 1998. I was actually one of the people that replaced it by the Pacific Harbor Line, which is a short line. Walter B. Allen was also tasked by the mayor to bring about the consolidation of the 2 ports, merging the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach. After World War I ended, the LA Chamber of Commerce formed the Greater Harbor Committee of 200. Their job was to plan for expansion of the port and seek more federal money to construct a middle breakwater. But only if the 2 ports merged. At least it looked like the federal government imposed this condition. Where did this idea come from, that in order for the federal government to spend money on building the middle breakwater, which is the breakwater over here, that the 2 ports had to merge? A master's student at USC in 1930 actually did a thesis on this and interviewed all the Army Corps people. Where did this idea come from? Well, no one was fessing up. I actually discovered a memo in the National Archives making it clear it was the business community in LA and Long Beach, the members of the Greater Harbor Committee of 200, that basically got the Army Corps to impose that as a condition because they wanted the 2 ports merged. So in 1926, both LA and Long Beach voted to merge the ports, but the cities and the port managers dragged their feet. And so, Allen, one of his things was to try and, move this forward. But when the engineer at the city of Los Angeles, this was the original scheme for the breakwater, came up with a scheme over here that would significantly increase the size of the harbor, and at half the cost, everyone was, and got Long Beach to buy into it. Everyone said, oh my God, the 2 ports are cooperating. And so this whole idea of merging the ports went by the wayside. But it's an effort that periodically comes up. I mean, that still happens today. Walter B. Allen was intent on keeping the Pacific Naval Fleet in Los Angeles. And to do that, Los Angeles needed an airport. So with minimal discussion, the Board of Harbor Commissioners approved construction of the City of Los Angeles' first municipal airport on Terminal Island. It opened a few months before Mines Field opened at the LAX site. And it was called, surprise, Allen Field, after Walter B. Allen. So I have discovered a clip of the opening, the first plane coming into Allen Airport on June 21st, 1928. So Allen, if you can roll the clip. It's about a minute long. And that's the fire engines racing out to the planes to be on standby. Walter B. Allen was on one of these planes. You know, the reason the Allen grandkids contacted me, they're in the aviation business, and they didn't know their grandfather had an airfield named after him for a while or whatever, and they were thrilled when I was able to send them a copy of this clip. So I'm sure one of these people is Walter B. Allen, but I don't know who it is. So the final blow for Allen came when he was identified as a key player in the great Los Angeles swindle, the Julian Petroleum scandal. Allen was part of the mayor's inner circle and a close confidant of a man named Kent Parrott, who was a political operative for Mayor George Cryer, who with his USC club, Old Boys Club, created a political machine that dominated the city government. And the sale of shares in the Julian Petroleum Company was a Ponzi scheme that bilked thousands of Los Angeles citizens out of their saving. So Allen was labeled by Reverend Robert P. Schuller, an evangelical radio broadcaster, as one of the Julian thieves in politics. And they were selling these little pamphlets at the newspaper stand. So for a while, there was some thought that Allen was being groomed for mayor. But this kind of sunk his chances. You know, Schuller, along with the Ku Klux Klan, would support the election of John Clinton Porter. And Porter was the mayor who actually removed Allen from his post. Porter only lasted one term, and he was replaced by Frank Shaw, who many people consider to be one of the most corrupt mayors of Los Angeles. He was the first mayor to be recalled from office in U.S. history. And the Port of Los Angeles was front and center when it came to reasons to recall Mayor Shaw. So Mayor Shaw put in Eloy Amar as Harbor Commission president. Amar was a member of a pioneering San Pedro family. He managed the cattle grazing operations on Catalina Island and Palos Verdes. It was kind of fitting because land that Walter B. Allen had bought for a rail classification yard was actually being used to graze cattle. And the Amar family also developed real estate in San Pedro. So this was the time of the union-busting racket squad. An unusual coalition of reactionaries and reformers wanted to get rid of Shaw. They needed to bring down somebody within the administration. Well, how convenient it was for the racket squad to raid a building in San Pedro being used for bookmaking when Amar was there placing a bet. He was arrested and lost his position, but he wasn't down for long. He went on to become the general manager, executive director of the Port of Long Beach for decades, and at a time when Long Beach was flush with oil money, and he used it to really build out that harbor. After World War II, Fortune magazine did a whole series of stories about the West Coast ports. And in that, Amar is talking about how he takes visitors in his speedboat from Long Beach over to LA to show how the poor conditions the wharves are, because Long Beach at that time had more money than LA did. And so the Board of Harbor Commissioners was pretty incensed about this Fortune article. So I must have driven past this bench thousands of times to and from my office at the Port of LA. And then one day I happened to really look at it. I'm like, oh my God, it says Amar 1910. When the city of LA tore down the old waterfront commercial district, Beacon Street in San Pedro for redevelopment, they saved the cornerstone of the building and they made it into a bench that overlooks the main channel of Los Angeles Harbor. So I think it's somehow fitting that the Amar name graces the waterfront over the Los Angeles main channel when he was sort of unceremoniously removed, booted off the Harbor Commission, and went over to the Long Beach side. And so I think if, you know, Amar's up there now probably chuckling, and he'd probably want to point out to people works that needs to be done in LA Harbor. So, when World War II broke out, Japan was our biggest customer. After the war was a period of rebuilding relationships with Japan. San Francisco thought, oh my God, here's a chance for us to regain our prominence as the significant port on the West Coast. And their strategy was to do that by embracing Japanese culture. And they figured it's easier to do a cultural exchange with Japan right now, so close to the war ending, than a business change. But the hope that if you do a cultural exchange, it'll lead on to business. So in the name of redevelopment, San Francisco plowed down Japanese Town and replaced it with the Japanese Cultural Center. In LA, our secret reppin was a maritime attorney named John McCose, who headed the Los Angeles office of Lillick and McCose. He represented a lot of Japanese banks. He spent 6 weeks after the war ended traveling through Japan, trying to build relationships. So on the Japanese side, he interacted with a man named Gaku Matsumoto, who was head of the Japanese Port Association. So San Francisco may have gotten the jump on us by having the first sister city, Osaka, but we had an even bigger coup than San Francisco. The first Japanese department store, and it was called Seibu at the corner of Fairfax and Wilshire Boulevard. And I'm sure a lot of you recognize this building. It's got a strange skin over it now. It's the Peterson Automotive Museum. But that was originally the Seibu department store. So McCose was also the person that Matsumoto went to when Matsumoto had this idea, I want to bring all the port people together from the world to Japan and hold a conference. And it was like, so soon after the war, you want to do this? Is anybody going to go? So the invites to the conference in Kobe in 1952 went out. The rejections came flying in. All of the countries tied to the British Commonwealth were just like, hey, we're not going. And so the LA Harbor Department staff did a yeoman's job trying to get people there. But the man on the right, Sir Esling Denning, was the British ambassador to Japan. He helped make the conference a success. He was banned from sending anybody to the conference, a delegate. So he complied with his country's wish not to send a delegate, but he got around that by sending an observer to the meeting. And this action was not taken lightly by the Japanese. And when I was researching this book, which was, from probably, 5 years, leading up to 2020, people in Japan, they don't remember his name. Yeah, there was the British ambassador who came to came to send people to the meeting, and it was just amazing that that was so important to them. So, and it paid off in cargo volume. And when the group decided to come together again in Los Angeles in 1955, Los Angeles became the founding location of the International Association of Ports and Harbors, and that organization still exists today. So ever since the progressive days of Gibbon, Los Angeles city officials always wanted to merge the two ports. Duplicate facilities, rate wars, Los Angeles' desire to get their hands on Long Beach oil money drove a lot of that urge to merge. But no more was that desire portrayed than in the actions of Assemblyman Vincent Thomas from San Pedro. He first ran for office in 1941 on a campaign platform, I hate Los Angeles. He also wanted to change the name of the Port of Los Angeles back to the Port of San Pedro. So for over 37 years in the California legislature, he introduced legislation to merge the ports at least a half a dozen times, beginning in 1949. He was unsuccessful. Long Beach always opposed the efforts. They believed the constant push by Los Angeles was evidence that they were growing in stature as a port. And so Thomas has his bridge, but he did not get the ports merged. So World War II forever changed the worldview of Port of Los Angeles. We had showed the rest of the world we can do more than move oil, okay? We can handle general cargo. But the port's customer base was shifting from local, California-based oil companies to international companies. And up until that time, the Port of LA had a tri-party type of governance. The City of LA the Harbor Commission and the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce for years. Whenever the LA Chamber, whenever there was a dispute, the two ports didn't get along or a problem with the customer, the LA Chamber would ride in on its white horse, bring everybody together, and try and resolve the issue. They did all the long-range planning for the port at that time, and they controlled who got on the Harbor Commission. So this book published here is a memoir called Building a World Gateway, written by the second secretary of the Board of Harbor Commissions, Clarence Matson, who then went to the LA Chamber. It was published in 1945, and I bought a copy on eBay. And so when I bought it, you're going to have to like suspend disbelief. This is like really a strange story. I've had a lot of moments of serendipity working on this book. When I got it, I opened up and it says, oh, to Jimmy Ingebrigtsen from Stanley Olafson, July 1945. I'm like, oh, cool. I have Stanley Olafson's book, you know, Mr. World Trade Week. You know, I said that was kind of cool. And I wasn't really sure who Jimmy Ingebrigtsen was, but I come to find out who he was. Post-World War II, there was a big battle over a fifth position, a vacancy on the Harbor Commission. And the chamber was supporting Ingebrigtsen for that spot. And the locals were supporting somebody else, but I could not figure out who that was. And I mean, I could not find out, no newspaper press. I knew the unions and the locals wanted somebody else. The chamber wanted this guy. One day I picked up this book, and this book was written before this event happened. And this 10-page memo slips out of the back, written on onion skin. And the title of the memo is, On the Situation in the Los Angeles Harbor Department and the Bearing Thereon of the Pending Appointment of a Fifth Member of the Board of Harbor Commission. And so I read this 10 pages, and I could not sleep that night. It was detail of who was on what side, who was doing what, who was supporting who, everything that was going on at that time. I got so excited about it, and the publisher, Angel City Press, did, that we developed a transcript of it, and it's in an appendix in the book. But the man who was, and I could not find this in any archive, who the locals wanted was John Rados of Harbor Boat Building. And once I had that name, I was able to find a letter written by a city attorney to Rados expressing concerns about conflict, so I was able to confirm that. So interestingly, John Rados never made it on the Harbor Commission, but his son Robert did in 1986, but he only served at one term. They built boats, and at that time, the boat company was awarded design contracts for the city sanitation and harbor department vessels, and so he was not reappointed. So, the 1960s. The Harbor Department's story in the 1960s has all the makings of a gripping detective novel. Corruption, graft, secretly taped meetings, indictments, a suspicious death, a Pulitzer Prize-winning expose by the LA Times. By the 1960s, trade through Los Angeles Harbor had grown faster than its terminal facilities, its longshore workforce, its own office space could handle. And all these factors came to a head with a new board that was appointed, eager to venture into the container business, but unfortunately they got embroiled in scandal. One of those scandals had to do with the Princess Louise restaurant, which used to be on Terminal Island, and then it was over in San Pedro. But I'm going to tell you about the World Trade Center scandal, which was a potential site for a new Harbor Department headquarters. It was such a convoluted story, it took an entire chapter. The man on the right, C. Irwin Piper, the city administrative officer. In the city of Los Angeles, Harbor Commission approval of a lease has to go through the CAO's office for approval. And when the CAO questions something, there's usually a good reason. In the case of the World Trade Center, Piper blew the whistle, but the council was not listening. The port tried to lease a large parcel of land on Terminal Island for construction of a World Trade Center, sole source without a competitive process, to a developer named Keith Smith, a city human relations commissioner, whose only assets were his liens against other failed projects. The council approved the project over Piper's objections. A groundbreaking was held. here you see Mayor Yorty sitting, and then the Board of Harbor Commissioner President Pietro DiCarlo at the groundbreaking. So just before this happened, the Harbor Department moved into the Pacific Trade Center on 5th Street in San Pedro, a building that was already owned by Keith Smith. So Keith Smith had offices in that building, and so that was kind of convenient for him to interact with the Harbor Department in the same building. So he had a conference room, and he decided to install a voice-activated tape recording system. He hired a private detective, came in, put in the voice-activated tape recording system. The guy put it in, left, came back the next day to see if it worked, listened to the tapes, left the building, and took the tapes with him. On October 18th, 1967, the LA Times published several stories about the World Trade Center deal, stock purchases by Keith Smith in Pietro DiCarlo's Cabrillo Savings and Loan. DiCarlo was also the owner of DiCarlo Bakery, which had been a San Pedro institution. Keith Smith's financial problems, and emphasizing that, hey, no construction has started. Piper told the press, unloaded on the press, about being called down to Portugal restaurant, walked in to find the entire Harbor Commission there, the mayor and Keith Smith, and they pressured him to support the deal. And Piper just told this whole story to the press. After the Times expose, the commissioners held a press conference. The head of the port stated, it would have been impossible to take competitive bids because we would have gotten all different ideas for buildings. And it didn't matter. The land was still there. We haven't lost anything. And the delay was not a worry because Long Beach had not started their World Trade Center yet. And that's kind of how they got it through council, by making like, we got to get a World Trade Center building before Long Beach did. And so a grand jury was called. So what's today, November 7th? I was reminded by Victoria, on November 7th, 1967, Board President DiCarlo got up, went to daily mass at Mary Star of the Sea Catholic Church in San Pedro with his wife, as was his custom. He went to church every day. And then he went down to the ferry building, okay, the big building there, to talk to the boat operator about a tour on the Poor's boat, the Angelina. So the Angelina is in one of these, is berth in there. You know, now it's the Maritime Museum, but it was a ferry building. Less than an hour later, his body was found floating face down, his hat floating next to him. His body was formally identified by another commissioner, but why he was on the scene was not clear. Was it suicide? Was it foul play? Was it an accident? The police report is gone. The coroners can't find the autopsy. I had lined up a medical examiner to review the autopsy, and I kept telling them, okay, look under D, look under C, because the last name's 2 words, but I could never find it. So in another one of those moments of serendipity about this book, I reached out to the DiCarlo family, one of the granddaughters, telling her about I was doing this book, and I had to deal with her grandfather's death. And so, can I meet and tell you what I know, and I'd like to know what you know. And so she said, yeah, we can meet, but my mother just died and I'm clearing out her house. So after that. So we met at a restaurant in San Pedro, and as we were sitting there, I noticed she had a file with her. And so it contained information that was never publicly released about her grandfather, you know, his activities that particular day. And she said when she was clearing out her mother's house, she had found this file, and my email pops up in her inbox about me doing the book. So she brought the file with her. And so that's another case of like, oh, my timing was kind of perfect. There are so many twists to this story. The tapes from the conference room were turned over to the grand jury. Keith Smith is heard talking about the commissioners he's got in his pocket, one who's in incubation. The commissioners were all indicted. They were tried and found guilty of accepting bribes or of conflict of interest in the case of the Princess Louise. Keith Smith goes on trial after the commissioners are already convicted. Keith Smith hires Joe Ball, Long Beach top-notch attorney. To win, Ball knows he's got to do two things. He's got to move the case out of LA because it was becoming fodder for the Mayor Bradley, Tom Bradley versus Yorty mayoral campaign, the first time Bradley ran, and he needed to get the tapes thrown out. So he listened to the tapes, and Ball notices what's missing from the tape is the guys were in there drinking, but the next morning, we don't hear the janitors picking up the glasses or anything. So he convinces the judge that the tapes were doctored and the tapes are thrown out. So Ball wins his case. So think about it for a minute. The harbor commissioners were convicted of taking bribes from a man who bribed them but was found innocent. So the World Trade Center was never built on Terminal Island. Long Beach, by the way, did go ahead and build a World Trade Center. The building on the right is the Pacific Trade Center. It was Keith Smith's building and Harbor Department headquarters, and actually worked in that building until the Mayor Bradley had, as part of the redevelopment, that port moved into a new building across the street. And it became the Logicon building, and then it became the View, and well, actually, it was blown up in 2006, and now there's an apartment building there, the View. So by 1969, under growing pressure for funding and watching Long Beach grow so rapidly, Mayor Yorty also supported merging the two ports. And he got the LA Board of Harbor Commissioners to vote to let's merge the two ports. And so the LA City Attorney said, okay, well, we can have Long Beach deed their port to us, or deed it to another agency, which of course we'll want to control, or we can operate it through a joint powers authority. And so Long Beach is sitting over there watching all these silly things going on and just kind of ignoring it. So Bradley succeeds Yorty in 1973. He too would rely on C. Irwin Piper. Doing this book, I have a lot of respect for Piper. Piper was very vocal about Long Beach being a better run port, and he also convinced the Bradley to push for merging the ports. But you know, by now the ports had figured out how to cooperate with each other, and they were doing it. The 1980s were a period of significant port collaboration on transportation and environmental projects. Of course, there were a number of lawsuits. They sued each other on environmental projects. So the idea became moot, and they dropped it. Now, this is a picture of the Bradley Board, and Bradley did something extremely controversial. He appointed the first woman to the Board of Harbor Commissioners, Jean Kaplan. It was a controversial appointment for a number of reasons, but the prevailing sentiment was expressed by Monsignor George M. Scott of Mary Star of the Sea Catholic Church in San Pedro. A woman commissioner, he exclaimed, the idea of the mayor sending down a woman to do a man's job. So I can't conclude without telling you how I tried to get women into this book. It wasn't easy, okay? Clara Shortridge Foltz, born 1849, died 1934. Her name graces the LA County Courthouse. First woman admitted to the California Bar, first female Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney. In 1913, she was part of the Harbor Investigating Committee that was appointed after all the harbor commissioners resigned. And she pushed for an elected commission, and that was a charter amendment that failed. Marion Osgood Hooker, born in 1875, one of two female members of the Greater Harbor Committee of 200, formed after World War I to push for that federal money for the Middle Breakwater. She was, and every member of that committee had to pay $1,000 just to be on the committee, to pay for the planning studies, because the chamber was doing all the planning. She was a fascinating woman. She became a doctor and a photographer. I believe her photographs are up at the Huntington Library. In 1903, she climbed Mount McKinley with John Muir, and there's a great photograph of her with John Muir. So I'm sure she could have stood toe-to-toe with the men of the Committee of 200. There was another woman on the committee, but I could never find out who she was. Marjorie Showstock, one of 3 female custom attorneys in the country. She was tapped to speak at the first meeting of that International Association of Ports and Harbors, and the only woman on the agenda in 1955. Honestly, I bet she was the only woman in the room. She was the first female recipient of the Stanley T. Olafson Award, the guy who signed this book, the award the Chamber still gives out every May during World Trade Week. And the Foreign Trade Association gives out an award in her name, and Women in Trade has a scholarship in her name, and she died in 2005. So my last slide is my cover slide, and I have to tell you my COVID story, another case of serendipity. So when I was doing this book, I came across the 1951 cover of the Port's annual report. It's there on the right side there. And so I thought, oh my God, there's the harbor, there's City Hall hovering over top. This is the perfect image for my cover because it's all about the city and the harbor and all of that. So we tried to use that cover. It didn't work. It was too damaged. And so I had to hire an artist to digitally reproduce the artwork for the cover, which is that on the left side. And so, you know, back then in the 50s, it was common for Harbor Department and maybe DWP, you know, city agencies with money to hire well-known artists to do their artwork. But I could never find out who did this painting. And so right before we went to print, the designer said, "Are you sure you don't know the guy's name? Because we really like to give him credit." And so didn't have it. Book goes to print, you know, it comes out, COVID hits, I'm spending more time at home. I go on eBay the first time in like 5 years because I had been buried for 5 years writing the book, and I always put in Port of Los Angeles. And this pops up. Whoops. Alan, I missed the last slide there. Something happened. It was there. Okay, there it is. This painting pops up. And so the person selling it says, unsigned, done in 1950. And I'm like, the year's about right. And my God, it looks like it's an actual painting. Artist's name is Chuck Caderna. And I never heard of Chuck Caderna. So I go online. I find out he's most well known for the modern representation of Smokey the Bear. You know, he did a lot of artwork for Northrop Grumman, like spacey ship kinds of things. He was born in 1921. So I write back to the seller and I said, how do you know what year it was painted and how do you know who painted it? And she writes me back and said, I was married to him. I'm cleaning out a studio. So I'm like scratching my head. You were married to him. He was born in 1920. How old is this woman? So my antennas go up. And so I go online, I track down Caderna's marriage certificate, and lo and behold, in 1963, he married a woman decades younger than him, and the first name of his wife matched the name of the woman who was selling the painting. So I bought the painting. It's gorgeous. It's very detailed. I love the title, Port of Los Angeles, the harbor that built a city. It would have been a great title for my book. And after I bought it, I sent her an email. I told her about it, and she said the painting wound up where it was supposed to be. So, and I kind of agree with that. So, that's it. Thank you. So now we get to go sit down.
All right.
It's like dark out there, so I got mine on.
There we go. Okay. Well, that was a lot of fun, and you know, a lot of serendipity, as you you know, pointed out. That could have been almost a subtitle to the whole process.
Yeah, it was just phenomenal, the things that would happen to me. Unfortunately, the guy, Jim Craig, from the Craig Shipyard in Long Beach side, the only man alive from the 1960s that was on either board, and he lived 4 houses down the street from me. I would trot down there, bring my tape recorder, and he'd always say to me, my kids keep saying they're going to tape me. Unfortunately, he passed away right before the book came out, so he never got to see it. Questions? Yes.
Okay. Jay, hang on. We're going to bring a microphone down so it can be heard.
Okay. Yes, one's very short. The Clarence Matson name brought up, is any relationship to the Matson steamship line?
No, I actually have it, in parentheses when I first introduced him. He's not. He was actually a reporter, worked in the transportation field, and then became the secretary to the board, but not related to Matson.
And the other question is one that from the beginning you said you're probably going to get, and that's if you have any ideas on the current problem with the backup that the court, that the port is engaging in, and how is the difference between it and is Long Beach doing better?
No, they're both in a world of hurt. There was actually a whole page in the LA Times today explaining, like a Q&A, but it didn't mention one of the things that's most critical. Maybe I can explain this by describing an incident that happened to me when I was port director, because everything was just pre-COVID. We called it just-in-time shipping. So one night, there's a MRF ship in at Pier 400, and we had an electrical problem, and 3 cranes working the middle part of a ship had a power outage for 8 hours. So the train pulled out of the terminal and heading to Chicago, and then on Labor Day, the JCPenney stores opened up in Chicago without their Labor Day sale items because of one 8-hour shortage that affected only 3 cranes working a ship where you might have 6 cranes working on it, or bigger ones even more, because everything is just in time. So the boxes, the stuff's tagged, whatever, it goes right to the make it a warehouse or a retailer's, and goes right out on the shelf just in time. Nobody has inventory. The inventory is like in the boxes, okay? When I was little and, we were going to do a big purchase like a sofa, you'd go to the factory, the May Company factories, warehouse for your sale. So pandemic hits, supply chain shuts down in China. They're not making stuff. The port volume drops. Nobody's got inventory. The stores run out of everything. Target, you couldn't buy, a basketball. You couldn't buy any athletic stuff. Everybody's out of stuff. So what happened during the pandemic, and I should say, the maritime supply chain has always had issues. They're exacerbated because of what's gone on, but we've always had problems with chassis, relocation, and all of that, empties, getting things in the right spot. There's a lot of handoffs. But what happened, and what wasn't brought up in the LA Times, is during COVID, people are home, people are doing a lot more online shopping. Are you buying more stuff? I don't know. The number 1 item coming in is furniture and household good. I know I did more stuff around the house when I was home. But Amazon opened up so it may not be people buying more, but people wanted their stuff tomorrow. So what did the big retailers and, Amazon do? Amazon built over 100 or opened up over 100 additional distribution points or fulfillment centers. I know I had my book in a fulfillment center for the whole first year of COVID. And so did Walmart, and so did all of these other big retailers, and they did that because they were trying to meet the demand of the tomorrow shipping, like I want it tomorrow. And so a lot of all this stuff we're still trying to fill all of these new distribution points with every one of the most common products because people don't like waiting. So it's a combination of all of these things. Factories have been up and down. Ports have been, have had COVID outbreaks throughout this whole time. They'll be okay, then they have another outbreak and they slow down. And so all those things rippling, but it's still, a lot of it has to do with building out a distribution network and getting inventory in position. So it's kind of a fundamental, we kind of went from just-in-time shipping to just-in-case shipping. And just-in-case means you better have it in your warehouse inventory. So as I tell people, like, if you're ordering something and it's not in stock, chances are you're not going to have it if you're doing your Christmas shopping, order stuff that's in stock, because it's, you can go on the Port of LA website every day and bring up, they do it like a daily thing. And it'll say how many ships are at anchor, and then it gives the average anchorage. I checked it this morning, 14 days at anchorage. That's an additional 2 weeks in the supply chain that wasn't there, just at anchorage. So, and then, everybody's having like issues. So,
My father used to teach just in time at the community college level, business administration, management supervisor types. And the way he always explained it to me and, and the rest of his kids was that you've got a small business, and just in time allows them to change their manufacturing focus from, say, building lawnmowers and, having them available in the summer, and then switching over to being able to make snow blowers and be able to sell them in the winter. That way you've got this operation that is nimble enough to change to whatever the next product is, and then be able to go back and forth and basically stay alive and be viable, and of course take advantage of any new changes that come along, or new products, that sort of thing. And so I've always found just in time interesting, and it exactly feeds into the whole supply chain problem. And now I have heard about just in case.
yeah, right.
That was being the new model is, well, we better get it and hold on to it just in case we need it. And that means a lot of people are sitting on things that they've already spent the money on, hope to God they use it. It's kind of like in, office supplies. You have a 10-year supply of printer cartridges for a printer that, maybe 5 years from now, it's going to be gone. And you're still going to have a half a dozen cartridges sitting in your stock room that are just, it's money wasted, it's product wasted, it's just, eventually it'll end up in the landfill probably. That kind of
So I ordered a shirt. My son is outside, hopefully, so for him for Christmas. And I was like, I wanted this one color, and it wasn't in stock. Delivery date, February. Or I could take the other color. It was in stock. So you buy what's in stock, because this other stuff is not going to make it in time if it's not already here, or at least floating out there.
Hi, this was great. I want to know, is it possible to get a tour of the port where you really, really get an understanding of the whole shipping process? A little more than just the drive around for an hour as a tourist thing,
right.
but an in-depth, historian's port tour.
Yeah. And actually, there's not much you see if you can go over the bridges, but you really can't get into the terminals. The best tour is really from the water side.
Yeah.
Then, or you have, to get inside one terminal. Generally, well, right now, I don't believe the ports are doing any tours. Generally, in World Trade Week, thank you, Stanley T. Olafson, Mr. World, he said, World Trade Week, every May, the two harbors will give free tours, and you just go down there. They have the big boats, and they just keep, like the Catalina-type boats, and you just line up, and they take them out for tours. A group could reach out to the port. What they used to do, well, LA used to have a boat. Long Beach never had a boat, but they got rid of their boat. So they lease boats. So a lot of times they'll lease a boat, and they'll combine a couple of different service clubs or groups. You have to reach out and ask if they'll do a tour for you. They don't do it as much as they used to, but they do try. And they were like doing like 1 day a week. And then, every group would have to be mixed groups on the tour boat. But I don't know what it's going to be going forward. So.
Something that I found interesting, and I was a little surprised about some of the reality that that was presented, is I always assumed that Harbor being one of those proprietary departments of the city of Los Angeles, along with DWP and Airport, you know, that any room they walk into at any time dealing with anybody, they're the 800-pound gorilla. You know, they're the ones that are generating revenue. They're the ones that, you know, they're the components you think of LA as being a world city, is the airport, the harbor, you know, the aqueduct, all that sort of stuff. And I was always curious as to whether, okay, does the mayor, the council generally, or the 15th district council member really have any pull with, you know, the harbor department? I mean, they could certainly say and ask and threaten and so forth, and I always imagine the harbor department and the board kind of looking at them saying, okay, and what time are you leaving? Let's get back to what we
No, they actually do have a lot of authority. As a matter of fact, it's different on the Long Beach side. The Long Beach Harbor Commission is basically the final say. They can approve a 30-year lease with like a shipping customer. But all long-term agreements in the city of LA have to go through city council. So if I was going to have a lease that was, you know, like, I forget if it's 3 or 5 years now, a lease longer than 5 years, I had to get it on city council agenda. That means I had to get it past the council member for the 15th district, okay? Then I had to take it through the committee, okay? Then I had to get it through the CAO, and then, and actually the mayor's office, actually first, before all that, the mayor had to be up to speed, and then it would get agendized, and then I'd have to go up there. And I have to say, when I worked at the city of LA at the park, I hated having to do that, because, and actually Long Beach always used that as, hey, you make a deal with Long Beach, you know it's a deal. On the LA side, you make a deal with the poor people, you don't know if it's really a deal because it may not make it through council. And so Long Beach always had that and would play that up as an advantage. So of course, then when I was at LA, then I went to Long Beach, then I went back to LA. So I was back at LA at the top. Then I'm like, I hate having to do this, and it took so long. But I have renewed respect for it from researching this book, because of the things that the harbor department tried to do and get through city council. And you had C. Erwin Piper saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, this guy's got no money in the bank, and you're giving him, you know, like 68 acres on Terminal Island, you know, and he's got all these lawsuits again, you know, and so I appreciate the process. Of course, I felt it wasn't necessary during my era because we weren't doing stuff like that. But I appreciate the checks and balances when you're trying to operate the business, and you're negotiating with somebody, and you want to lock them in, and you don't want them to go to Long Beach. You want to make the deal and make sure it sticks. So.
And Geraldine, this isn't a question. I just wanted to recommend the article you brought up in the supply chain in today's Times. I read that article, and it's not all the ports. One of the things is they don't have enough electricity generation in some of the manufacturing centers in China.
Oh, yeah.
So they're only running one shift a day instead of 2 or 3 shifts, and that's costing between a week and 2 weeks delay right there. And then the article goes through and through the whole supply chain and gives you information about what's causing the delay. So it's a very good article.
Yeah, and it's from the view of a small shipper, you know, as versus the Walmart, which has a lot more clout. So.
And another topic that I found interesting is that there are so many more kinds of professionals involved in running an operation like a port. I mean, it's not just about the engineering, actually creating the portage, the wharfage, and actually creating the infrastructure, the dredging and all those sorts of things. But then you get along to, you're getting federal laws and state laws and saying, well, we've got these environmental regulations that you have to observe, and so you have to bring in a completely different type of professional to do that sort of thing. And then you have all the other constituencies that want their little bits and pieces. And it seems that running something as complex as the Port of Los Angeles, even before the supply chain issues, even before COVID, there are just so many layers of bureaucracy that are there for reasons. And, you know, how can one person or a group of people explain to, you know, the larger public, you know, hey, all of these, you know, these are all things that we have to do.
Yeah.
And there's reason for it. And you point out, you know, all the checks and balances are there because, you know, people abuse the system and for decades. And so now presumably all these things are there to eliminate that. But then there's the environmentals, because all that's important. During, I think it was during your time as executive director, that they were doing the electrification of, you know, running electricity out to the ships so they could shut off the engines and, you know, try to run things a little bit cleaner. I mean, so you've got power generation, you've got, you know, the environmental elements of that. You know, there's a whole bunch of complexity and you know, there's a lot of stuff going on there. And it's all got to work exactly right the same time or else.
Yeah, it's very complex. I think that's what makes it so exciting. It was certainly a thrilling position to have. But, you know, the port's almost like operating a city. You know, we have the police force, pilots that were, you know, city employees that go out to meet the ships, construction and maintenance crew that, you know, would be out there, you know, working on the wharves. And then actually in the book I go through, as the port kind of evolves in the 1970s during the Bradley administration, and all of a sudden planning is important. You know, the port didn't hire its first planner until the 1970s. And the book kind of ends when the executive director of the port gives a speech to it actually was kind of the U.S. Sea Grant program. And he talks about why, you know, we're an economic engine and we don't have to mitigate, and we know, and then I get hired on, and then the book ends because I didn't feel I wanted to go into my time. I was still a student at USC when I was first hired at the Port of LA, and worked there for, you know, almost 5 years, and then I went over to Long Beach for most of my career until Mayor Villaraigosa brought me back to LA. But yes, I kind of went full circle because I started out working in the environmental. I mean, they hired me because I was a scuba diver, and we were transplanting kelp from Catalina over to the breakwater because the harbor was dead. There was like nothing, there was no oxygen in the main channel. There was nothing living there. And then, you know, and then I came back full circle, and, you know, the big focus, you know, you're running a business, but then there was the whole environmental focus of trying to get through that. So it's very complex. But you know, it's worth learning about. People don't understand. You know, I would go out to meetings with people like, say, you know, gateway cities or out in Moreno Valley, and, you know, meet with the mayors out there, and they're like, you know, you got to get rid of this truck traffic. And I'm looking at them and said, will you stop building these big warehouses then? I mean, it's like they didn't make the connection. So, and there was one public hearing where a woman got up at the podium and said, what do I need a port for? I can get everything I need at Walmart. That's not a joke. That individual actually said that. They don't make the connection with picking something off a shelf in a store, and that it had to go through. So that article in the Times is really worth, because this poor guy is trying to get his board game. Oh yeah, it's about board games. You know, he has board games made in China, and he's trying to get them in time, you know, for the holidays.
Geraldine, my question is related to the biographical part of the book, and you touched on the beginning. It says, I have two questions related to each other. So how does an environmental scientist become a director of a port? You started by saying you were a scuba diver, but I would imagine most directors are not, like Mario Cordero is a lawyer, right? And so how does that work? How does an environmental scientist become the general manager of a port? That's the first question. The second question, biographical, is you said this book was based on biographies of individuals. If you could write the book differently, what would the theme be? You mentioned earlier it could be labor strives, but what would the theme be if you could do it again or thought about that?
So the first question, yes, I had kind of an odd background for a port director. because I have a bachelor's in zoology, a master's in environmental engineering, and a PhD in marine biology. And I started out at entry level in the environmental office. And so I went over to Long Beach and I headed up the environmental office. And let me tell you, environment at that time was a dead end, you know. So I had to move out of that, and I moved into, you couldn't really go to like get a college degree in port management. There are some programs out there now, but you learn a lot on the job. I got into port economics, port transportation. I ultimately became the planning director. And I stayed in that position. I was probably planning director for 10 years, and then I became managing director and was responsible for all development at Long Beach, and then eventually became the number 2 person in Long Beach. You know, I was a nose to the grindstone, just producing work, and grew in the job and got very active nationally and internationally in port issues. And so I was never going to apply for a job at the Port of LA. I looked at that as, oh my God, who'd want to work in that political hotbed over there? And the flyer for the job showed up in my inbox at Long Beach. And I read the, job description, and they're looking for someone with an international reputation in port environmental issues. And I'm like, whoa. That's weird, because there was only one international committee on port environmental issues, and I was the chair. And I'm like, that's odd, And then I read the description, and I said, it sounds like me. Sounds a little strange. I had this tingly feeling. I said, this sounds like me. So I submitted an application, and, after a couple of weeks, I got a letter back and said, thank you for your application, but there are many more qualified people. So I'm number 2 at Long Beach, the number 2 port in the country, and I'm already bumped out in the first round. And so my husband tells me, oh, they sent you the wrong letter. And I'm like, big mucky-muck recruiting firm is not going to send out the wrong letter on a job like this. He said, yeah, they sent you the wrong letter. And I'm like, no. He said, you should call them. They sent you the wrong letter. So I'm like, I'll show you. I'll call them. So this was the stupidest phone call. I'm dialing. This woman picks up the phone. I'm like, oh, my name is Geraldine Knatz. And I'm like, oh, did you send me the wrong letter? I wanted to have a bag over my head. And I hear her ruffling all these papers. And she said, oh my God, I sent you the wrong letter. And I'm like, so she said, she'll send me the new letter. I get the new letter. It's addressed to a man that I never heard of. I didn't recognize the name. I'm like, this is unbelievable. So it gives me an appointment at a hotel in LAX Saturday night at 6 p.m. I'm obviously the last thought, because the guy's person's probably interviewing somebody, and then let's stick this person on the end. So I drove up there. I went up to the room, and so it's too funny. I'm sitting there. There's a little table there. It's like a bedroom with a little table there, and there's a guy across from there, and he's asking me questions, and I don't think I'm the most boring person in the world, but the interview goes on, and he goes like this, and I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? So I start talking louder, and I'm like, oh, do I knock over my cup of ice water in his lap? This was it was so mortifying. And, I finally got him. And so the interview ended, and I remember I came back into the house. I was like a dog with my tail between my legs, dragging. And of course my husband, oh, don't worry, you just have to get in the next round. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. This guy fell asleep. So I made it into the next round, and I'll never forget. Then we were at a hotel, another hotel in LA, and they kept moving it because the press were trying to find out who was on the short list or something. And so as I go up there, we had 2 rooms and there were 2 panels, and the headhunter says to me, he says, when you go in there, just don't talk so loud. And I felt like saying, I have to wake you up, buddy. I don't want them falling asleep on me. So anyhow, and then I got the job. Then you had to have the interview with the mayor and, all that. But, it was like, I always, but I saved that letter. You've been bumped out, so that's they're my little archives.
So what are the accomplishments during your time at the port that you're most proud of, and which ones got away from you that you wish you would have been able to, initiate or fulfill, or, hopefully someone down the road will pick it up and carry it forward?
So, I think the thing that I'm most proudest was I had a board with the mayor put some strong environmentalists on it. And they basically gave me free rein to develop the Clean Air Action Plan and the Clean Truck Program, which were, very unique for a port to set air standards. And, the Clean Truck Program banning trucks by model year to get rid of the old diesel trucks. I mean, we had a phenomenal success in that program. We battled it all the way to the Supreme Court. Being able to go into the Supreme Court and sit there and see the justices, that was kind of like a highlight of my career. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was so tiny, and just her head sticks up over the desk there, and so I think I'm the proudest of that. I think there were some projects that, you never finish anything. I feel good that we got a waterfront plan for San Pedro approved. We started negotiating the lease. I never was, the lease has been finalized now, but we never got through that whole process. So there's a lot of things that carry over. But the clean, and honestly, people, that was back in 2006, 2007. I was chair of the American Association of Port Authorities, and I tried to get the whole American Port Association to adopt a resolution on greenhouse gases and climate change and stuff, and I could not even get that through the board at that time. That was where the sentiment was at that time. So a lot of people thought we were arrogant, but one of the customers came to me a couple years after this and said, when I was in my first meeting with you, I thought, this woman is crazy. And he said, you were right. We had to get rid of those trucks, and so that made me feel good.
And is that program, where's the state of that program now? Is it still viable?
Yeah.
Is it still doing its job? Is it actually expanding and getting better as, new ideas, new technologies, and things like that have come up since your time?
Oh, yeah, there's new iterations of the plan, and the big one now is to have all the terminals electrified by 2030 and all of the trucks turned over again to zero-emission trucks by 2035. So we put in free fees, and now they have fees starting again, to raise money for truck grants and what have you. So it's still continuing, but, I would say some of these newer things are a little harder. At the time we said you got to get rid of these, you have to have a 2007 model year truck, you could go out and buy one. You can buy an all-electric heavy-duty truck now, but the mileage is limited on it, the range. So, so there's always a ton to do.
So I have a question. Hi, Joan. How does the development of the Port of Los Angeles compare with other ports around the country? Were there similar trends in corruption, oversight? I mean, I know different ports developed at different times, but based on your experience and in doing the research?
Okay, well, there's a book, Empire on the Hudson, about the history of the Port of New York. That's a good read. As a matter of fact, I would say the man who was my mentor on this book, and he reviewed my grant application for the research funding to do this book, was the author of that book. That's a great read. There's been things that happened at Oakland. There's been things that happened at Miami. I'm sure, there was a time when there were not conflict of interest laws. And, many of these businessmen served. They were taking time from their own work to devote it to the city. But, there were no conflict of interest laws, and so they didn't think about those things. But I'd say you could probably look into any port's history and find some things. But, I can remember things, scandals in Miami and, things going on in New York and things going on in, some of the other ports. So.
Someone had asked me this a little bit earlier before we got started, and I promised I'd bring it up. During the whole NAFTA process, the negotiations and all of that, Was there some sort of talk at some point that maybe somewhere south of the border, somewhere along the Mexican coast, that there was going to be a port project that was going to, challenge Southern California's ports and maybe even the Gulf of Mexico ports? Was there anything like that you ever heard about, or what became of that, if you know anything?
Well, there are ports like Lázaro Cárdenas, that are in Mexico that actually compete with Los Angeles and Long Beach. Los Angeles and Long Beach competes with the Pacific Northwest. We don't compete so much with Oakland, which does a lot of export of, ag products and things like that. We have lost market share since, I was involved with Beat the Canal. I was there when the big LACHS project was being built. And I can remember very early on being invited down to meet with the Panama Canal Commission when they were deciding whether or not to expand the canal. And I remember telling their board, hey, LA and Long Beach can't do everything forever. Expand the canal. And, thank God they did. There's a lot more stuff that, that goes through the canal. But, there's a backlog at the canal as well now. So, yes, but we do have competition from those ports. I mean, LA is the market to beat because you can bring goods into LA and you can get it anywhere, to any place. And so, we had our study done where in every congressional district, we identified the top 2 businesses that either exported or imported through the Port of LA. So I could be in Washington, D.C. at a cocktail party, and if I knew Congressman so-and-so was going to be there from, I don't know, North Dakota, or somebody from, Alabama or something, I could name drop at least 2 businesses in his district that did business with the Port of LA. It made for very, fun cocktail conversation.
So I don't know if you heard anything recently about Governor Abbott in Texas, saying, we can move stuff from Los Angeles to our ports over here, and his port authorities are saying, no, we can't.
Right.
And up in Sacramento, I think there was one commissioner. I think it was the state harbor. There's a state level, and they're saying, well, look, there's a process to all of this. We can't just turn this stuff around on a dime. There's contracts. There's vetting and all those sorts of things. We'd love to be able to, turn everybody loose on everything and drop all of the requirements and all of that kind of stuff, but we can't. There's a process that has to be followed, and I'm guessing that someone coming out of left field like the Port of Houston is saying, don't put us in there.
Yeah. Well, any port can probably handle a 10% surge, but nobody can handle the volume of an LA and Long Beach. I mean, if it's just like you could take all the other ports in the country and, it still wouldn't probably be as big as the LA and Long Beach. So we're handling, basically 40% of all the goods coming into the country are coming in through LA and Long Beach, probably more than that, 45%. And so you can't just the ship, sometimes the ship will divert. But yeah, there are agreements with railroad companies, with contractors and whatever, and warehouses for the goods to go a certain place. So they'd rather wait at anchorage than divert. Now, they can divert maybe, if they can make arrangements to do that, but that's not something you can do on a dime. In 2002, when we had the lockdown, and all the ports were shut down, you had ships waiting out there like, you have today. Some of them went through a canal, but, it didn't take many of them before, Savannah and Charleston were chock-a-block. They can only handle so much. You don't have the equipment. You don't have the labor there. It just doesn't happen. So, but, you've got Savannah is now the number 4 port in the U.S. It's growing. There have been a lot of investments in that port. And I think one of the things you've probably heard from the current port director is over the past decade, the U.S. government has funneled more money into East and Gulf Coast ports mainly because the canal had opened up and they saw some market share shift. But when you get into a situation like that, well, you can't build for, as they say, Easter Sunday. You can't build to, that would be a waste of things, because the Port of LA really has a lot of long-term capacity in its facilities. And a lot of it has to do with lack of digitization in the supply chain, lack of visibility in the supply chain. You have the director, Gene Soroka at LA, trying to put in a system. You have Long Beach customers who don't want to use that system. They're tied to another system. It's not like the airlines where they interchange and they can see what's going on. This is a pass off from one company to another, and a lot of these systems don't interact with each other. And there's been major changes in the way, like we handle the chassis. Those containers have to go onto a chassis, okay? And it used to be the steamship lines, the Maersks and the big ocean carriers owned those chassis. Then they divested of all them and it went to leasing companies. And then the leasing companies tried to pool them so you can, you wouldn't have to return a chassis to the same terminal. But some trucking companies decided to buy chassis because they were having a hard time getting chassis and they want their chassis back. And so there's just all of these things. But a lot of it has to do with getting data. I can remember in about 2012 bringing in an economist to explain to the port customers the difference between a push system and a pull system. So a trucker would come up to the gate, he'd, have his information, he'd be needing a container, and then the terminal operator would say, okay, that container is in row 5, and oh, it's on the bottom. So we have to send a longshoreman over there with a hostler to move this one off, that, move that one, move that one over there. Oh, and get that one, and then they got to pick it, and then they got to put those back in there. Instead, pull. The trucker was coming in and pulling the box to his rig. Okay. So in the last couple of years, they started something peel off, which is pushing. So every truck comes in, you just go and you get the next container. That works if they have the data from big retailers like Walmart or whatever, and they have time to pre-position those boxes in one part of the terminal, and they just whip them out. So I track the turn time in trucks. That article was off when it said a trucker may have to wait 5 to 6 hours. A long truck turn time is the automated terminal is the fastest. Now it's about 50 minutes. The slow terminal is about over 80 minutes, 90 minutes sometimes, once they're in the terminal, but they may be waiting outside, waiting to get in. But yeah, that's wasted time. But a lot of that now is because there's so many boxes, they're stuffing them every place, that there's probably a lot of pull going on instead of push system.
Hey, maybe this is, I don't know any of these dynamics, but are trucks the majority of, is trucking the principal way of moving cargo from the port, or is rail still a big portion?
It's split between truck and rail. So half the cargo goes east of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, our next biggest market outside of the Southern California is Chicago. That's Heartland, okay? And so, but not all of the, so there's on-dock rail, and some terminals do about 25%, maybe 30% of their business on on-dock rail, right from the terminal, right from the ship, right to a rail, okay? And then it pulls out, okay? And heads, that's if you got enough boxes, like you're going to JCPenney in Chicago, got enough boxes to do that. Maybe not JCPenney anymore. That was like, but, maybe Walmart or something. But some of the rail yards are located in downtown LA. So a trucker will come and there's one like about 2 to 3 miles from the port. So they'll pick up that box and they'll take it that 2 to 3 miles, and then they'll go back and get another one. So both ports are trying to build out more rail inside the port to eliminate as many of those truck moves. Very little goes cross-country, long-haul trucking from the port. We call this drayage. It's back and forth stuff. It's not long haul. A trucker may take a marine container to a warehouse, like say in Carson. They may offload that container there, unstuff it, restuff a 53-foot long domestic container, and it may go out by Hunt or something like a domestic trucking company. But these are 40-foot marine containers. The domestic ones are the longer, like 53-foot ones that go long haul in the U.S. Isn't transportation so fascinating? You know?
It is actually. And something else that that I was kind of surprised by, and unfortunately because of what was happening in Orange County, the that oil spill because of the the pipeline
right.
down there. It never occurred to me that there was the possibility that something that might be sitting out there at anchor and might. I guess the thing is, well, gee, how many more of those do we not know about?
Yeah.
In LA and along the entire West Coast because of our our habit of bringing oil in from from the offshore rigs.
Oh, the problem is that they ran out of anchorage space, so the ships were drifting. I was over on Catalina Island, and you look out, and there's a container ship where a cruise ship usually will come in, sit off in the anchorage off Catalina Island. I mean, that's how bad it is. So, so when they're drifting, yes, those kinds of things happen. I actually asked somebody about whether the well, not the pilots, but the captain of the ship has visibility into the data in terms of where the pipelines are in that. And I'm not sure I really got an answer. It's like, I got an answer. Yeah, you got to go to marine cadastre. You got to do it. I'm like, the captain wants to be able to look at something. You don't have to tell him to go online, find this website, look this up, look that up. It's like, so visibility of the data is really key.
And one last question that I have is that there was an announcement the other day that the cruise ships for 2022, they're anticipating at this point in time there's going to be about 200 cruise ships coming and going from from the port of LA and probably from Long Beach in 2022, and that's the most that they have seen since about 2008. Now, cruise ships are actually relatively late to coming into port. I mean, you used to have cruise ships coming back in, but someone pointed out that the cruise ship industry, as we know it now with Princess and the other ones, is only about 50, 55, 60 years old, relatively new as far as that. So human cargo, what kind of an impact does that have on a port operation where you've got so many other things coming and going?
And not that much. Of course, cruise ships were hanging off there anchoring, but each port, LA and Long Beach, have a cruise berth, and those operations occur, and probably about 200 ships a year is probably a reasonable amount. And so cruising's coming back. It was growing very rapidly until COVID, so we'll see how people react to going on cruises. So there was a question.
I think I have a question for maybe one or two more, and then we'll have to wrap up.
President Biden recently mentioned that he was in negotiations to get the workers to work 24/7 at the ports. And I guess my impression was that our ports are so busy that even prior to the pandemic and this supply thing, that they were working 24/7. So do port people up to this point, have they just worked from like 8 in the morning till 5 and everything stopped?
No, the ships basically work 24/7. What was sort of 8 to 5 were the gates, the terminal gates. And for years, the terminals were operating 2 shifts. They may not do 2 shifts every night, but they may do it like 3 or 4 nights, maybe have a weekend gate. And that is limited by how many boxes can go to a warehouse that's open at 3 a.m. So the 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift is the one that's the third shift that wasn't really being worked. Whether they, honestly, it sounds good when you say these things, but there's the practicality of doing it. And I think that there's been some efforts by, some warehousing and retailers have announced they're increasing their hours to be able to accept shipments and things like that. So it's got to be the ports just can't. Otherwise, they have a gate sitting there and they have longshore workers standing around getting paid, double time at night, and if no trucks are coming in. And if you're a trucker, and most of the truckers are independent owner operators, very small businesses, they may want to work during the day and then be home with their family in the evening. So,
Thanks. And one other thing is the promise, the promise of the Alameda corridor. Has it fulfilled its promise as the major transport from the ports into like the Vernon and the city of industries? That been functioning well and it's fulfilled its promises?
yes, it has. It has. There's been a few years when, during the slowdown when the ports had to help with the debt retirement, the debt service for, one particular year or whatever. But yes, all the trains funnel up the Alameda corridor. And as the port continues to build out more rail on, within the port, that all goes up the Alameda corridor.
Thank you.
And it was a nightmare when you'd have to drive and get stuck behind these trains. So.
Okay, I guess we've got one more. Okay, one more.
Just real quick. So is the Port of LA and Long Beach, are they planning on expanding further? Can they expand physical space?
Well, they have a jurisdiction, a harbor district. LA has built out major islands. Long Beach has the space to do that. But instead, they purchased part of the old Wilmington oil field, and they got the naval station. I actually kind of go into that in the book. But they have potential for expansion, yes. Not inland, but seaward, okay? And so they also have the ability, they redevelop facilities and reuse property. Not every piece of property is being utilized right now. There's odd pieces that have to be redeveloped.
Okay, well, I think we're going to close this out. Thank you, everybody, for coming out for our first live event since February of 2020. It's kind of scary. It's been almost 20 months. We're going to go ahead and go to the lobby area where Geraldine will have books for sale and for signing. And so we need to close up get out of the theater here so they can close things up.